This is a webinar on self-talk, and specifically self-talk as it pertains to skiing and snowboarding performance in yourself, as well as your students as an instructor. The mental performance aspect is, in my opinion, one of the most underrated topics in the snow sports instruction world, where technical discussions about edge angles and femur rotation tend to trump the mental aspects that actually lead to performance, especially when under pressure. Tonight's speaker is a good friend of mine, Quinn Ferguson, a mental performance consultant with his master's in sports and performance psychology. Additionally, he's also a member of the PSIA Eastern Region's Alpine Development Team, so he's more than qualified to break down self-talk in our ski instructor language. And with that, I hope you enjoy tonight's webinar.
Self-talk is a pretty cool mental skill, and I love to discuss it, primarily because language and the way that we speak not only to ourselves but to other people is something that we commonly overlook because we use it all the time. And many of us, we have an internal dialogue constantly going, and therefore, what is always in sight is not something that we always tend to give a lot of attention to, because it's kind of commonplace for us, right? And then the brain says, oh, well, this is something that's quite normal for us to do. Why should I question it? Why should I bring more self-awareness to something that seems to work just fine for me? So I think the first thing I'm going to ask all of you to do tonight, as we discuss this, and if you decide to share, or if just while you're listening to me blabble on here, is to consider the language that you use as, I suppose, trying to take away the normalcy of it, and really decide to question the normal day things that you say and the normal language that you use. And I'm going to try to stop saying normal so much, but this is really an inquiry into how we speak, and that's what self-talk is. It encompasses all language. So this is kind of the idea that we want to be lifting the veil, so to speak, on something that is always ever present in our lives, and really kind of take a new look at it and how we can use it as an advantage for us. So with that being said, right, the what and the why of self-talk, so to speak, and how we view it as a mental skill. So self-talk is a direct line at our focus. Actually, language and our internal dialogue and things that we say are a direct line at our ability to focus. I think that's the best way to kind of look at it and begin discussing it. When we're talking about something, we are focusing on that very thing. And therefore, it's easy to see language and the way that we speak, not only to other people, but to ourselves, as an indication of where our focus is. And if you take anything away from this topic tonight, and if that's the thing that you take away, then fantastic, right? What you are currently thinking about is an indication of where you're focusing. And that might sound very obvious, and it is obvious. And yet, if you decide to take that leap of going past the obvious norms of your language, right, and decide to say, hey, I'm going to look at this a little deeper tonight, you'll find that can actually be quite a useful thing, okay? Even the simple little internal things that you say to yourself while you're skiing or while you're coaching, right? Those things, they tell you something about where your mind is. And that is an incredibly powerful tool, like I said, by itself. You could argue that's primarily self-awareness, if you ask me, but it's self-awareness through the language that you're using. So first of all, self-talk directs focus, right? Very important to know, okay? Second thing, language creates boundaries for us. We're going to go into this more in a philosophical way later in the chat, but to put the summarized version of it, our language is our boundaries of our understanding and what we can do and what we can focus on. If you're unable to put something into language, okay, in some sort of way, it's quite limiting in many, many ways. Not completely, I'm not an absolutist, and as I'm sure many of you have experienced expression through many other ways besides verbal. I'm not saying you can't express yourself otherwise, but your language and your ability to use it is most certainly a boundary marker for you. And therefore, understanding that is really, really important. Understanding that you can move the boundaries is also very, very important, right? So your language is not a limiting thing. It's just something that tells you where your boundaries are, right? And the way that you speak to yourself is going to set up where your boundaries are. Language is limitless, right? For the most part. I mean, there's only so many words in the world, I suppose, but there's a lot you can do with those words. Any questions so far? It's okay if not. I'm going to try to get through this basic stuff. And if there are any questions, I'm not going to be looking at this chat very often, so please just unmute yourself and fire away. I'm not I'm not one to be offended if you decide to interrupt, or I shouldn't even use interrupt as the word, to add or to collaborate, I suppose. So language heavily influences states of mind, right? So we're going to get into this, and it's going to be a little bit more neurological, I suppose, the way that I talk about this. The state of mind. What is a state of mind? Well, you can think about the mind as a big laboratory of chemicals, and what it's constantly trying to do in order to create a state of safety and comfort for you is take information from your experiences and what you're currently doing, and create a general state of, I don't want to call it equilibrium, because not every state of mind is of equilibrium, but it's trying to create some sort of state that makes it more efficient, so it doesn't have to be worrying about the chemical outputs that you need. So language plays a role in this, because the way that we decide to label things in our lives and the way that we decide to make sense of things often comes in language, through internal dialogue, but also the way that we're speaking about it to someone else. And therefore, there is a direct line into the type of state that we're going to be in based on the language that we're using to describe our current situation, right? So even something as simple as like, wow, when it's cloudy outside, I feel sad, right? Like you can wake up one day, you look out, you'll see that kind of melancholy, cloudy, rainy night, or day rather, morning. And your mind will associate those things with certain experiences and certain feelings and conditions that you've been told, and will create literally a chemical state for you based on that, right? Your language has the ability to not only break down those states of mind, but also to reinforce it, which is incredibly cool, if you ask me. The how and when, so to speak, of self-talk here, okay? We're going to talk about verbs a lot as our method of training our self-talk and the way that we speak, which I think is going to be really cool. I'm not going to get too into it now because I want to save that for the end. But we're going to be focusing a lot on verbs, so you can kind of think about that a little bit now and save it for maybe later when we get to it. And then, of course, 24/7, right? So you are always having some sort of dialogue going on, whether it's internal or whether you're talking to someone else, right? Language is ever present for you. And so therefore there is always a chance to be able to work on your self-talk, which is actually one of the big reasons why I chose this topic. When Brandon was like, you can choose, I was like, what should I present on today? Or not today, this was a month ago now. And he's like, oh, like whatever you want. And I reached out to a few people, and some of the feedback I got was, what's something that you can do right now, right? Most of us are skiers. If we talk about something that's ski related, it might be difficult for you to implement something that you'd learn now, on the hill tomorrow, right? There's no snow, unless you're in Chile or South America, which I keep seeing people are down there and enjoying lots and lots of snow. But with self-talk, you can work on it now, literally. And even in this presentation, hopefully some of you will begin to think about the way that you're speaking and the way that even I'm speaking about whatever the topic happens to be. So that should be exciting. Yeah, simply put. Any questions based on all that stuff? That could have been a lot to some people and not a lot to others. And if there are no questions, I actually would like to somewhat open up the floor and simply ask, does anyone here have any background with self-talk? Have they been taught it before? Is this the first time you're hearing it? And, I'd encourage anyone to share any of their experiences around this topic before we go on.
I just got to say, as a coach, race coach, we've worked with a lot of athletes over the years on this topic, and particularly in terms of, kids can get down on themselves and try to put them in a good space at the start of a race.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Quinn, I was just going to add that I have so much noise in my head. There's definitely 24/7 talk.
Yeah.
But working with you this winter really helped me target. And, we worked with how that language starts a run or helps me focus. So
yeah,
it can get better.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Darcy. I appreciate you being so open about that. So it's absolutely true. And Reed, thanks for sharing as well. Cool background being a race coach. I'm sure it's a little different sometimes than when you're instructing the type of performance we're trying to get, right? There's different outcomes that are needed in a competitive setting as opposed to a setting that's more geared around what's this called, learning and improvement. Not that racing coaching is not about that, but obviously it is competitive juices can change things sometimes. So the science of language, I think it's really important for all of us to make sure we're talking about the same things and on the same ground as we begin this discussion. So I'm going to give you a little bit of cool background about how impactful language can really be on your mind and therefore on your state of being. And if we think about performance as a state, a physical and emotional and mental, even a spiritual state of being, right? We think about the mental skills as ways to influence that state of being. I'm sure many of you have heard about, let's say, flow state before, right? When an athlete is in flow state. Well, by the nature of it, right? It's flow state, right? It's a continuous and multifaceted level of performance that we reach. And it involves the mind, the body, right? How you feel. And of course, often at times, many describe it as something that's transcends human experience in a way because it becomes quite spiritual, becomes out of body, which is really, really cool. And I hope everyone here has had the chance to experience that once in their life. And if not, well, maybe what you learned tonight might help you get there, get closer to it. But I think the first thing we begin to discuss is neuroplasticity and what that is. But so all of us know, neuroplasticity is pretty much the ability for our, our neural connections and our neurotransmitters to grow and our neural pathways to grow and to change, right? It's pretty much the essence of that, like evolution, right? We have the ability to adapt, and we do that with neuroplasticity in the brain for the most part. It does not just stop when you hit the age of 25 or 18 or whatever you've been told, when you stop developing in that way. Neuroplasticity has been shown, and it's quite proven, that neuroplasticity exists all the way into the very, very late stages of life. It's harder to have those adaptations occur as you get much older, but that doesn't mean that they don't occur. And part of the reason why it's harder is actually because of this cool thing with neuroplasticity, in which that it reinforces, okay? It reinforces the pathways that it has. And that can be, why I put it here is indifferent, right? It's indifferent whether or not it's good or bad for you. It just simply does that. And that should be actually somewhat of an empowering thing to consider, because pretty much what it's saying is that your brain is going to do something amazing for you, in which it has the ability to grow and to change. If you decide what you want to put into that, it'll take on that form for you. And you, because you have consciousness and willpower as an agent, you have the ability to decide what you want to put into your brain, what you want to put into your life, which is, like I said, a very empowering thing. You don't have to worry about the actual complexities of how it happens. It just does, which I think is a really, like I said, very cool thing to consider. Language, I think, reinforces this in a much more powerful way than many other factors, because many of our actions and our behaviors are understood through language, right? We do something and we're able to actually put words to it, or even actually more commonly, we put language to something and then we go and do it, right? It's premeditated, right? I'm going to get up and I'm going to go brush my teeth, or I'm going to do something like this, right? Now, of course, obviously, really ingrained behaviors are also a pretty direct way that reinforces this stuff for sure. But for the most part, language is going to be attached in some way or another. Is that a hand up, Krista?
Yeah, I'm curious about your statement a second ago where you said it reinforces pathways that already exist. So would that mean that it is easier to default to things that you already know and learn and harder to change those habits?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's way harder. Everyone's heard this before. It's harder to break a habit than it is to form one, right? So like form good habits is like the essence of that moral or that fable, so to speak. So yeah, when you begin to do something and you create a connection, like a neurological connection, at some point you're gonna have to rewire it. I think that here's a really cool analogy that I heard once about the brain and neuroplasticity, and especially neural connections. There's a small town, and this town has a big lake. And every year, after winter and after the snow goes away, and the spring comes, all this long grass grows along the lake. Okay, and people want to go down and enjoy the lake. So, the first person who decides to make that journey to the lake that spring, looks around and decides to walk through any random area of the grass and, steps on the grass and begins to walk on it. Eventually, other people come and see where the path already is, right, and begin to walk it. Next thing you know, there's like a path that's made, right? You can think of like neuroplasticity a bit like that, right? You do something, it happens, and as you reinforce it, the path gets flattened, right? And then all of a sudden, people don't even think about like, oh, where am I going to walk to the lake? They see the path and they go. It just makes the most sense, right? The brain is going to work to be as efficient as possible. So, the issue with that, of course, is that when you have certain habits and ways about going about things, you're going to always resort to the defaults. What's important to know is that you can decide to choose a different path. It takes hard work and effort, but you can do it. And I think therefore you kind of get forced with this very, actually, I would argue, existential question, which is like, are you willing to put the effort in to make a change about something? And, that is I think a discussion for another time. Truthfully, I think you can do a whole PowerPoint on that. Actually, it almost sounds like my colleague Phil is doing something quite similar to that. This is why. In was it 2 months, Brandon? On the 27th of September.
Yeah, in September.
Yeah, right. So, that's, like I said, it's a whole other conversation, which I don't want to dampen that if people are curious to talk about that. But for the sake of keeping ourselves focused and on track here, we're going to get back to self-talk. But you can rewire these things. And it does begin with, or rather I should say, a good way to begin rewiring these things is with your language, because language is so direct and it is so accessible, right? You can immediately change the way that you decide to say or label something that is occurring to you, which is really, really important, as opposed to sometimes if you want to make an immediate behavior change, you need to wait for the right context for that behavior to occur, right? But language can be reinforced and can happen almost at any time, which I think is, once again, a very exciting thought, to know that you can create change, with simply by putting yourself aside, being thoughtful about your words, being thoughtful about what kind of thoughts you're having around whatever the given setting is. So anyway, neurotransmitters. What are neurotransmitters? This is going to be a pretty layman's explanation of what a neurotransmitter is. So pretty much it's like the messenger, right? So like something happens, you have a connection, neurotransmitter makes a connection, and then there's some sort of outcome from that. In the brain, that's through chemicals, right? We have serotonin, dopamine, cortisol. These are all probably things that you have all heard before, right? Serotonin and dopamine are reward, happiness, cortisol, anxiety, right? It's the anxiety one, stress, really. These chemicals can literally be triggered and regulated with language. This is like one of my favorite studies to talk about. And if someone would like to read it, I will find it and send it to you if you're curious, because I have it somewhere. It has to do with cortisol. There was a study done by Harvard in which they had two groups of people. I believe it was a ropes course they were putting them through, but it was something quite challenging. And one of the groups, and by whatever the challenge was, it was daunting enough to them where you were going to feel somewhat stressed about doing this. And one of the groups was told to use some self-talk beforehand and to label the stress that they were beginning to feel as excitement, right? Instead of feeling stressed about doing the course, it was, we want you to feel excited about doing the course. And not only did that group prove to be much more successful in doing the course, but after they showed much more moderated levels of cortisol in their brains, because by simply telling themselves that it's not anxiety and stress they're feeling, but rather it's excitement to do something, their brain immediately said, oh, you know what? We don't need to keep sending cortisol here because it's not so much of a threat. It's actually something that's exciting, right? So that's a pretty cool connection. And there's lots of other studies that, that kind of go towards this with self-talk, about how the way we label something can actually directly influence how our brain is going to respond. And our brain's going to respond, if you remember to earlier in the conversation, it's like a big chemical lab up there. It's going to respond through hormones and chemicals. That's what its job is. And it does that with neurotransmitters. So are there any questions about that? Because that's can be somewhat of a confusing idea to think about, but I hope I was able to explain it somewhat simply to everyone. Yeah, I'm getting some nods maybe. There's some looks around here. Good. Sweet. Cool. Yeah. So also, side note, I would like to mention something about cortisol quickly, because I think people hear it and they think immediately, oh, stress and anxiety. Cortisol's purpose is to shut down your prefrontal cortex, which is the reasoning part of your brain. It's doing that because in our way back when we were more nomadic and we were hunting and surviving and running away from things, your brain, when something stressful was about to occur, in order to survive, we want to shut down our reasoning and just do something in order to survive, right? So it sends cortisol to the brain. Okay, that's like the primary purpose of cortisol. So when you begin to get stressed about something, if you're thinking about going maybe to an exam, right, or even simply maybe your first time giving a lesson, or taking on a really big group of people, right, or being thrown into a lesson that is a higher level than you ever taught, or whatever it happens to be, right, you're going to get a little bit of cortisol. And it's not going to be because, you have like a saber-toothed tiger running at you, as you would have maybe thousands of years ago, or that your life is in danger, but rather your brain is saying, here's something that's quite important to you, and we want you to go on instinct. So we're going to try to give you this extra help in order to do that, right? Which is cortisol. The reality is that we really need our brains to think about things in a lot of these situations. So think about self-talk as a way is to literally control that, to understand your stress and your anxiety towards something as actually quite a natural thing that occurs when important situations happen in your life. And simply by relabeling it and beginning to understand it as something that not only is natural and is supposed to be happening for your brain, is something that you can actually control. And wow, what an amazing and awesome thought it is to think that I have a say in the stress that I feel towards a situation that I'm about to go into. So, once again, if that's what you take away from this conversation tonight, that alone is quite empowering as well. I'll give an anecdote. For my level 3, I remember I woke up that morning. I hadn't been nervous the whole time I've been training for it that season, but I woke up that morning and I felt like sick to my stomach. And I used self-talk to reframe that what I was feeling wasn't a sense of doubt, but rather was actually my body getting ready to take on something that was really, really important to me and something that I wanted to do, so much to the point that I signed up for it and was traveling the mountain to go there, right? And that labeling of that feeling immediately put me at ease and actually made me quite excited. And I didn't feel sick anymore. I don't want to say it's easy to do, but it is that simple to do, right? And one of my favorite phrases is, simple does not mean easy. So there's hope. If I can do it, you can certainly all do it. Okay, so I began to talk about this a little bit, labeling our behaviors and feelings. This is kind of correlated to almost what I was just talking about, right? So when we have rushes of serotonin or dopamine or cortisol, right, we don't actually think to ourselves, oh, I'm getting a cortisol bump or I'm getting a serotonin bump right now. Those things often express themselves in terms of a behavior or a feeling, right? Like, oh, I'm getting serotonin, I feel like pretty happy, right? Or, I'm getting some dopamine, I'm feeling like quite rewarded for whatever it was I just did. Okay, we don't think to ourselves like, oh, the chemical is doing its thing. It shows up in a very more humane way, right? Is that fair to say? People can resonate with that a little bit. Maybe some nods, some yeses. And therefore, once again, right, your language and the way that you're understanding those feelings and those behaviors that are happening to you are going to, well, reinforce that in some sort of way, right? So like if you begin to feel cortisol, right, if you begin to feel some stress and you begin to feel a bit anxious because of that, which is a very natural thing to feel when you get a cortisol bump, you might begin to say to yourself, oh no, like here it comes, I'm starting to get stressed. And then there you go, you're going to be reinforcing the very thing that's occurring to you, right? Can people see how this, has anyone actually experienced this before? Surely people have experienced it before in some sort of way. Yeah, Scott, please.
Going back to your antidote, Quinn, let's see, which self was experiencing the nervous stomach and what self was talking to it to relieve that stress?
Yeah, so good question, Scott. That's actually a very fitting question for you, I think, as acceptable as you are and as I am. So that would be, so I'm very rooted in my psychology and Jungian psychology. So how I understand the self is that, your primary decision maker is your ego. So my ego is telling me when for most of my daily stuff, right, your ego is driving you, right? So when I wake up in the morning and I get into the shower, I turn the shower on and I notice maybe the shower's a little colder than I would like it. And I decide to turn it up. That's my ego making that decision for me, right? Your ego is like it's the front of your mind. It's what's constantly there. But deeper within you, there is, of course, the real psyche. There is what I like to call often is like the witness, the true self that's deeper in there that experiences life and the world as we know it through the mental side of life, the physical side of life, emotional, and then of course the somewhat spiritual side of life. Yep. And that's kind of a deeper consciousness, I suppose. And there are definitely moments in your life where you feel that deeper consciousness and you can kind of take the ego and influence it more, right? I'm sure all of us in our lives have felt deeper consciousness at some point. Often it comes, unfortunately, when we're feeling more pain, when something's very real to us in that sense. I know even myself, I just had to go through a difficult situation with our family dog, right? And last week, and I was totally distraught. Had to put her down, unfortunately, and I was very sad. And yet, in that moment, I also felt very alive because something triggered a very deep connection and needed me to be more present there, right? So when you ask that question, I suppose the ego will be the initial self that says, okay, this is bad for me. I'm feeling stressed. What do I do? But the deeper conscious self is the one that decides to override that. And building a better, stronger, more conscious self, and in turn building a stronger ego, is something that takes a lot of time. But what we're doing right now, talking about language and the way that we decide to use it, is most certainly a gateway towards doing that, right? Bringing more self-awareness and consciousness to the words that you use. It is a direct challenge of the common language that your ego uses all the time in daily life. Does that kind of answer your question somewhat?
Yes. I typically see that second character as the observer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are all, if we're able to observe ourselves, then we've got two selves that we're dealing with.
Yeah, in many ways. And I think this is where maybe the idea of mindfulness comes into play. So this is the idea. This is the idea that, your thoughts are not who you are, right? The mind's job is to think. And so you cannot turn off your mind. You will always be thinking, and you will always be having thoughts. For most people, those thoughts come in the form of language. There are people who think in, colors and shapes and in images stronger than words. And so I'm not going to say that we all do that. And, but many of us, majority of us, do think more often in language. And the point being is that when you can begin to separate yourself from that stream of thought, you begin to realize that, to your point, Scott, that there is a secondary self in there. There is a true self that is able to separate from just one faculty of living, which is your mind, right? Which I think is a very important and empowering thing as well. So obviously, there's something quite cognitive behavioral here going on, right? The way that we think influences the way that we behave and we feel. So if I can override, certain chemical processes happening when I feel stressed or when I feel happy or whatever it happens to be, right, I can therefore influence my behavior, right? So, I'm thinking about what Reed said earlier, how he works with racers who, get into a certain headspace before a race, sure, right? And I'm sure you've heard, well, actually, Reed, let me ask him, I'm gonna put you on spot, like, what are some things that you've heard of your racers say before a race that maybe would be unproductive to them going down the hill?
I think there's a lot of setting up of lower expectations, right?
Yeah.
There's that aspect. I've heard kids comment, that this kid's better than I am, or focusing on tough part of the course as opposed to focusing on, the solid practice that they've had and the preparation that they've had and things that they've done that are in their control that can make them do well.
Yeah. Well said. And I mean, we could go into the reasons of why people set themselves up in that way. But at the end of the day, simply put, it's very much a way to protect yourself from something, right? From what you could call as pretty much as failure. And so you use language that quite indicates that, right? And that kind of goes once again back to that original point about how language very much indicates focus and where your focus is. So if I have someone who's already before the race has begun is beginning to discuss, where they compare with other kids, their focus is more so on where they're going to finish relative to everyone else, as opposed to what's important, which is like getting into a task-oriented place so that they can ski well, right? So language, once again, is a great way, direct way to not only understand where your focus is, but also then to redirect it, because you can decide what you want to say. And when you're able to have some mindfulness to what Scott was bringing up before, and you're able to separate your thoughts in this way, in which you're able to say, okay, like this thought that I'm having, right, is just a thought, and I can take different language and take a different thought if I'd like to, then you can begin to change what your mindset is towards whatever it is you're doing, which is, once again, incredibly empowering and very cool. So there's the science. here's the philosophy of language, and this is a little bit less objective as the last slide. This is a bit more of my own personal theory, and also I'm going to cite Ludwig Wittgenstein at some point here, who's a famous philosopher, a linguistic philosopher, who's quite well known within the world of philosophy. If people don't know much about him, I'm not going to be talking about him very much, but I'm heavily influenced by his understanding of it, and I will mention him. But the philosophy of language, right? So meaning and use. I think what's important to understand about meaning and use is how relevant context is, and specific context especially, right? So yes, words have literal meanings. I get that. I'm not going to act like that's not the case. But most of the time, actually, I would argue all the time, specific context provides real, true meaning to the word that you're using. So for an example, I was working with someone today, one of my clients, and he's a professional baseball player, and he was talking about dancing with the pitcher when he hits. Is he literally dancing? No. Okay. But that's the verb he uses. That word has a lot of meaning to him. It puts him in a certain state so that he can perform to a very high level, right? It's context. It's a very specific context, right? And he uses that word to give him this very specific meaning. Okay. Is he literally dancing once again? No. Right. But you can see how the word makes sense. And I can even assume that most of you, when I originally said that, could kind of understand what I mean, what that means. Right. Who here has understood skiing as a dance with the mountain? Can anyone throw a hand up or nod? Right. Or a dance with gravity, I've heard before. Right. Yeah. Are you literally dancing? Probably no, not by the exact definition of it. You're skiing, right? But it could feel like a dance to some people. So I think this is a really important point, because it begins to lift the lid and makes you think more so outside of the box, right? If you can take language and begin to apply it to meaningful situations, well then, you begin to really open up your world in a lot of ways. I'll give you a really good example. For me, when I'm skiing, I really like to I like to look to my turns with a lot of like hunger, as if I'm hunting for something. I want to be like ravenous when I'm looking at like my next turn. That might sound quite odd to many of you, but what it does is it makes me feel committed, right? And it has much more meaning than me just saying, "Oh, I'm going to commit to my turn," because God knows everyone has said that in their lives. And it's like, what the hell does that mean to commit to your turn? Everyone says commit to your turn, right? Oh, just get downhill. Well, I use different language in order to have it mean something specific to me, right? Like, I like that. I think I told Pete this once, but it's like, I had to think of myself with, like a fork and knife in my hand, like getting ready to eat a big piece of steak or something like that is when I'm going downhill. That's the kind of feeling I want. And so those are the words that I use in order to get into that state of performance, right? As opposed to things like commit yourself downhill or, well, actually, this will be fun. What are some of the most common things you've ever heard on a ski hill in terms of phrases or words? I'm going to put all of you on spot here for a minute. Surely we have them. Okay. Yeah. Attack next turn. Thank you, Magda. Also appreciate that you're here. We've been talking a lot about how we discuss this with ourselves, but think about how you discuss this with your students and the people that you're coaching, right? Like if I'm in a group of people and I'm coaching them and I tell them to commit to their turn, the chances that they've heard that from another coach I would imagine are relatively high, right? So how can I use different language to describe something that we all talk about? Right. Most ski instruction and ski training revolves somewhat around the 5 fundamentals. Okay. The 5 fundamentals can be explained in, I don't want to say limitless, but like in millions of different ways. Right. And therefore there's millions of different ways to be able to say something, even though, if you want to look in the PSIA handbook, you can find the exact language who here ever actually uses that language? Hopefully everyone's shaking their head, right? You don't use inclination and angulation with your students, right? You use different words to describe things. Yeah, Krista, what's up?
So I'm wondering, your earlier example of dance with the mountain. It seems to me like that is a word that has some descriptive feeling, some emotional feeling, whereas a fundamental regulate the magnitude of pressure has no emotional anything to it, right? It's a description. But if you were trying to get somebody to do that, to tell them to dance would be a very effective way because it just has something more descriptive to it. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, as we're doing self-talk, it seems to me that those kind of words that come with loaded words, I guess, that come with more than just the word itself are more useful as teaching cues.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that's important to consider here is that dancing is a verb, right? So like when we talk about nouns, often at times those things are going to be quite specific because they refer to something specific. But a verb is something that you do, right? And when we're skiing, we are doing something. And we want to be teaching human movement, right? That's like the essence of ski instruction, is that you're teaching someone to move. Therefore, it ideally your cues should involve verbs of some kind. And so, those verbs, choose them wisely, right? The more specific they are, the less or the smaller the net you're throwing out there, right? When you're trying to get people to buy into whatever it is you're trying to teach. And not only that, but when you cast a big net and you use a word that is loaded in that way, especially a verb like dancing, right? That is quite universal. You're allowing the people that you're teaching to the chance to be able to connect with something that does have a lot of meaning, that is loaded. And then ideally, when they give you feedback, you can get more specific, right? Being specific should come later on. In the beginning, you need to keep things loaded, right? When you're discussing something with a group, is what I would argue. And I don't want to make it sound like that is the necessary thing. But when we're talking about language and the ability to rope people in, using loaded words and more generic words at first can be a really good tactic to coaching, I would argue. But thanks for that point, Krista. I appreciate that. And then I think we just answered this. How does it influence how I behave and how I feel, right? So the words that you use, right, they're going to mean something to you that will give you a sense of purpose to what you're doing. An example is like, let's say I'm teaching a kid and this kid loves basketball. He's like a 7-year-old and maybe he's really stuck in his pizza, and I want him to start picking up his inside foot, right? Picking it up and putting it down. Well, I could tell him to dribble his inside foot. Can you dribble your inside foot like a basketball, right? Can you pick it up and put it down, right? That verb and that word is going to have a lot more meaning to that kid, ideally in this situation, right? And it then will therefore influence the behavior and the feelings that kid is having towards skiing, right? I'd imagine that everyone here has done this in some form in their coaching before, probably with other people. Have people done it with themselves, right? Which I think is an interesting question to pose to the group here. How often do you do that for yourself, right? It's very easy to get lost in the instructor jargon when you become an instructor, and to think about when you're coaching yourself, like, how do I think about something that I'm doing, right? But when you treat yourself like your own student, you begin to kind of reopen and rehash your own understanding and your own cues of whatever the fundamental, whatever it is you're working on, which is a pretty cool thing. I would wager. So language is a tool. This is really important. Hopefully I've kind of made this clear. language is, although it sets boundaries for us, right? It does dictate a lot of things for us. Our language is not the sculptor. We are, right? The language is just simply the tool that we use, right? And I think that's a very, very important thing to understand. And this can be, I'm going to go back to actually the point that Scott brought up before about mindfulness, right? This can be best understood by realizing we are not the things that we think. So when you have a stream of thoughts and you're putting language to it, it's very easy to have those things feel as if that's who you are. But if you're able to understand that you can pick and choose the words that you want to assign to the thoughts you want to accept, then all of a sudden the language becomes much more of a tool to who you are, as opposed to having a mind of its own and kind of shaping who you are. A really important distinction when you're looking at language. It is a tool. It is something that you can practically use in order to get across a certain point. I've been doing it for this whole presentation, right? I have something I'm trying to explain to all of you, and I'm using language to do it, right? It's not who I am. I'm just trying to find and use the right words and the right examples to be able to get a certain idea across, right? It's the essence of communication in many ways. I know it sounds obvious, but we don't think about it that way a lot. And then, of course, this is the Wittgenstein thing I was talking about. I had to throw this in selfishly. So Wittgenstein's theory of language is that language limits our world. So your ability, he's a little bit more absolute about this. Your ability to describe something and put it into language will always limit your ability to understand something. Take that as you will. You might not completely agree with that. I think there is a lot of truth in that, to be fair. You can think about it as simply as, if you can't explain what's happening, then it's going to limit you. And a really good way to put this is like, as a coach, right? As someone who teaches something, right? Which all of you are. You might be able to know how to do something in your skiing, okay? If you can't put it into words, then it's going to be almost impossible for you to be able to teach it to someone else. Okay. Yes, you can ski it and your students might be able to see you do it. And that might be a way for them to communicate with you. Okay. But it's not going to be the most direct way. Your language, for better or for worse, language has become the primary way we all communicate. Other species don't use language in that way. They have different forms of language. They don't use verbal communication, right? But we do as humans. We talk. Right. So your ability to put things into words with accuracy and with a level of thoughtfulness to the words you're using is going to be a major mover in your ability to coach other people and also, very importantly, yourself. And that's kind of part of what I was alluding to before, which is like, how many of you get really stuck in the instructor jargon, right? And think about how like, oh my God, I've got to separate, my leg from my upper body from my pelvis, right? Like, oh my God, I've got to do this, I've got to do this, and like get really stuck in these things, as opposed to beginning to think about that concept with a totally different verb and context, I suppose. How often do you do that for yourself? And the cool thing is that ideally, if you begin to do that for yourself, you'll probably end up beginning to do that for your students too. Funny enough, I don't know what it is with people who decide to get really good at things. We often don't water our own gardens as often as we should, right? I think teachers do this thing where coaches, because coaching is a form of teaching, you kind of do this thing where like you get good at being able to teach other people, but like sometimes you don't do it for yourself, the very things you preach to others. Remember that you should treat yourself like a student at times. Actually, if anything, all the time. You might find that there's still a lot to go, and it could be quite rewarding for you. Okay, so we've talked a lot about a lot of things that actually happen. Great. How do we actually do something about it? Okay. Well, training self-talk, this is also one of the reasons I chose this topic, It's really simple. Okay. First of all, it starts with like some self-awareness. You have to be aware of the things that you're saying. Okay. Not only to other people, but to yourself. What is the internal dialogue you're currently having? Right? Right now, all of you are thinking, I'm sure of it, right? Are there words to those thoughts that you're having? And like, what are those words? Simple as that, right? Bring some self-awareness to the language that you use. The nouns, the verbs, the adjectives, everything. How do you describe things? Self-awareness is where it begins. If you're not aware of it occurring, then you can't solve it, right? I talk about this with a lot of the athletes that I work with, your ability to adjust is everything, but you can't adjust if you don't know that you need to adjust. Self-awareness is is expanding your ability to adjust, right? It's that simple. You have to be able to bring some self-awareness to what you're saying. What are some really good tactics to building self-awareness about the things that you say? Journaling, okay. Voice recordings, right? Self-reflection through voice recording, literally hearing yourself talk. How many of you do not like to hear yourself talk when you hear yourself on a recording? Yeah, I think maybe most people, right? It's always a little bit cringy. Try it. Do it for a week. Every night before you go to bed, do a self-recording about what you did that day. Something as simple as like, I'm gonna reflect on my whole day and literally just list off all the things that I did. And then when you listen back to yourself, it's like, wow, it's interesting how I describe these things that I do in this type of way and use these types of verbs and these types of adjectives. There's lots of ways to bring self-awareness. So like I said, you can journal, you can voice them out. You could even, if you have someone that you're comfortable doing this with, right? You could collaborate together, right? And decide to pick a grouping of words that you want to be able to use throughout the day, verbs that you're supposed to use, hold each other accountable. Another way I like to do this is I choose something that's meaningful to me, and then I try to rewrite it using different words, like 10 different ways, right? That's a level of self-awareness, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm forcing my mind to think about whatever it is that's important to me, using different words, okay? So like, why is skiing important to me? Well, it's fun. Great, okay. Can you describe that in another way? Like, why is it fun? Can I do that 10 different ways? I'm bringing self-awareness to something that has meaning to me, right? In this case, through language or by writing it down 10 different ways. I would like to hear from the group here. There's so many ways to bring self-awareness to something. What's a way that you could do that you could bring self-awareness to your language?
I'm thinking about the energy that it brings and the feelings that it causes. I'm thinking about redirecting some of the negative talk, or not so much a negative talk about myself, but the negative talk or the energy that I'm bringing into my space. And if that's what I'm focusing on, where that brings me.
Okay, cool.
So redirecting that and thinking about using more positive words or positive description, or just avoiding the topic altogether if that's not serving me.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing.
And one of the keys for me is to listen. I just don't listen. I'm just all about the thing and all about the doing of the thing and achieving the thing or getting all the things done. And I rarely listen to what I'm saying to myself.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Also, not what I'm saying out loud, but more.
No. I think what's really important what you just said is that you're listening to yourself, your internal dialogue, right? We often think when we're listening, we have to be listening to other people, but do you ever actually listen to yourself? I actually asked all of you to do that briefly, right? I said, like, what are you thinking about right now? I'm sure everyone here has some sort of language you're putting to your thoughts. And it could be, oh, wow, like I'm being really tired of listening to this guy talk about the same thing over and over again, whatever it happens to be, right? Like there is language to your thoughts. And how do you bring self-awareness to those things? And I'd argue that there's lots of ways to do that. If you can dedicate a little bit of time each day to do it in whichever fashion you see fit, that alone can be huge for you, can be massive. It's a little bit of effort, right? And that goes back to that original point that I made, which is at the end of the day, you're going to be faced with this existential question. It's like, how much effort am I willing to put in to change this, right? The way that I talk, or the verbs that I use, or the way I talk to other people, right? Magda kind of just referred to it a little bit there about what I would call this reframing, right? So when you bring self-awareness to what you're saying or what you're hearing from other people, then there's got to be this moment for change, right? How can I reframe what I just said? I think what's really important about this is a lot of people talk about self-talk, and especially positive self-talk. I really don't like positive self-talk. I think it gives the wrong impression. A lot of people hear that and they think, oh, I have to like spin whatever it is that I'm thinking about into this very like positive, I don't know, nonsense. That's not what positive self-talk is. And that's why I don't even actually use, I never describe self-talk as positive. I always say productive, right? Is like what you're saying to yourself or to other people, is it productive? Not is it positive, right? Is it helping you, right? So like, you're in an exam and you're skiing and like you mess up a turn, okay? You telling yourself like, oh my God, I messed up the turn, I suck. Like, is that productive? No. The opposite though is if you reframe that and you say, oh, you know what? Like, I absolutely, like I'm trying to think. I've programmed my brain to not think this way, and so now I have to think of this way. If you mask it in some sort of way, right? Like if you deny yourself of the fact that you made a bad turn, right? You say like, oh, you know what? I can make like I can. I don't even know what the language would be. If you try to make it something that it's not, that's not good either. That's my point, and that's what positive self-talk can often sometimes imply. Is that you're masking something that's bad that's happening to you or something that's not ideal, and you're making it okay. Like, no, that's not the point. The point is are you making the language productive for yourself, right? That's what's most important. And you should reframe things in a way that allow you to keep moving on and keep going towards what your end goal is. Does that make sense? Yeah. Is that a raised hand there, Magda?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Scott put in the chat, how are my thoughts or serving me? So it's what you said, not a positive nor negative, but how are they serving me? And the other part, what you started the talk about, the thoughts are what you're thinking, that's where your focus goes. So it's not positive, negative, or you just need to decide what you want to focus on. Because if you want to focus on something, by all means, right? But it's like, how is that serving me? And where I direct my focus, what am I doing with it?
Yeah. Well said. Well done. I totally agree with that. Absolutely. Krista?
I wonder, like, your thought about not positive self-talk just for the sake of like, that was a bad turn. No, that was a good turn. Well, maybe it really wasn't, but maybe what I need to do is focus the self-talk to whatever I maybe didn't do quite right in that particular turn, that my self-talk is more like, hey, your outside hand needs to come up, or you need to move more into the or whatever that is. It's like the self-talk needs to be useful self-talk, not just cheerleader self-talk.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's really well. I love that cheerleader versus useful. It's absolutely true. And sometimes you need a little bit of cheerleader, a little bit of motivational self-talk, right? But it's about like when you're using it, right? And why you're using it. I think that's the most important thing. And then a really good point you kind of actually just brought up a little bit there, Krista, is what kind of language are we using when we make a mistake? And especially, I think this is actually a cool conversation for all of us to have, because we're all coaches or teachers in some sort of way, but we also are thinking about how this could apply to ourselves and to our students, right? When you or even one of your students doesn't perform the task or whatever was assigned, whatever it is you're doing, optimally, okay? What kind of language do you use to correct that or give them a cue? Are you going to talk about what they just did, or are you going to talk about what they ought to do on the next go, right? The same thing should happen with yourself. And I see this all the time. Actually, I listen to this all the time, in which people are quick to say, hey, like, I just saw you ski, and like, I saw your outside ski begin to diverge at the bottom of your turn, right? Great. Like, what next, right? Not what you've done is you've brought language to something that's already happened to the past, and you've left the student in a place of the past, right? Or if you're internally doing this to yourself, you're thinking about something that already happened, right? It's not wrong to bring self-awareness to that, right? This is like part of actually movement analysis, right? And the whole like SBI, right? Like specific behavior, right? You saw something that happened, okay, good. But as the coach, or even for yourself or for someone else, right? Think about language that promotes something that you need to do now, something that's going to happen, right? Don't dwell on something that's already has happened. You can use the past as a useful piece of information towards what's going to happen, but don't just leave it in the past, right? I think that's a really important thing to consider. And that's what I was going to get into verbs here a little bit. And I'm going to skip through one thing because this has to do with tenses, right? What kind of verbs do you use? And more importantly, like what, I'll get to your question 1 second there. What kind of verbs are you using, but like what tenses are you using them in, right? Like you did this, or like I am doing this, right? The verbs that you use, the tenses you use them, they have a lot of meaning because your focus is going to be on what tense you're talking in, which I think is really cool. Yeah, there are a couple questions here. Brian or is that Dave? Either one of you guys, go for it.
Yeah, Quinn, I just wanted to just kind of go back a little bit. Obviously, we're all waiting patiently for ski season to come up and happen. And for me, that means a lot of golf. And, one of the things I tend to do on the golf course is really get stuck on a bad shot. And, one of the things that helps me is just kind of framing that mindset, not getting stuck, in what's that expression, can't see the forest for the trees. It's really easy to get stuck on minutia, especially minutia that's stuck in the past, and you kind of lose sight of the big picture. And I think that's one of the really important things is to focus that language, in a linear direction moving forward, and let what's behind you be behind you.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree, Brian. And I think your focus is something that gets better when it's more when it's really, really specific, right? So like when you think about being in a flow state, or you think about like working on something really hard, right? Your focus gets really dialed when you do that. When your language can be really accurate, right? That means that your focus can be more accurate. So if you so this is why I'm talking about things like the tenses of the verb that you're using, because like that is an indication of where your focus is. Right? It tells you if your mind is still back there, if it's looking forward, or if it's in the present. And I see Audrey said, I feel using future tense can be the most productive. I'm not going to say what's going to be the most productive and what's not, because I just don't feel like I don't want to be speaking about something that is not necessarily objective. Okay. But what I will say is that, the future has its hesitations as well, right? The future can bring a bit of anxiousness at times because you're anticipating something that's going to happen. Okay. So, you have to keep, I like present tense verbs a lot, right? Especially when you're trying to cue someone up. If you want them to think about something, have like a certain ski thought or even a swing thought, if you're playing golf, right? It shouldn't be, it ought to say, it ought to be something that's, present tense. And that is, I think about verbs that end in ing. So like, I'm swinging, or I'm moving this way, right? Or I'm stepping this way, or I'm swinging this way, or whatever it happens to be, whatever the verb is, right? I'm dancing this way, I'm dribbling this way. And I don't want to discredit Audrey's point. Future tense can absolutely be productive too, right? I think if anything, it's definitely a bit more productive than past tense, but present tense is a way to directly grab your focus, right? If you give a cue in the future tense and you give the thought to be in the future tense, you're still allowing space for when that cue is given to when whatever it is you're talking about has to happen. But if you give something that's like really direct, right, then the focus is immediately there.
Quinn, I feel like it could be kind of like a wind up, like I will do something, and then you kind of transition into I am doing it. I'm going to do this, and now I'm doing it. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely, Audrey. Yeah, that's why I want to be clear.
Sorry, that was like, I kind of got there as you were talking, but
it's a really good point you bring up. I didn't mean to make it sound, I just wanted to also provide context that like, everything's a double-edged sword, right? The yin and yang to everything. So like, there's nothing that is just solely good. There's always a consequence.
Because I feel like sometimes too, like if you're going negative, so a lot of people do that negative self-talk, we kind of say, I will not do this, I can't do this, but then changing that to I will, and then eventually getting I am, like I feel like personally, I feel like that has happened to me, like when talking self-talk. I'm just an anecdote.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, what's up?
So say I threw in the chat, I love the benefit of self-talk, and self-talk is really the only benefit of self-talk is to the self. And we're talking about trying to get clear for our students, which is important. And Reed hit something on the very beginning of this call by listening to his racer speak about something that wasn't going to help the racer succeed, to be as productive as that racer could be. Yeah. So I'm listening to your implication of how do we apply self-talk to ourselves, which I think we've done really, really well. But then how do we apply self-talk to our students so that they can open up the learner in them to accept, try, learn what we are trying to get them to learn?
Yeah, well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, great question. And I think actually this kind of comes back to that point of, the way that you coach yourself is a big implication of how you're going to coach other people. And funny enough was my point is that it doesn't always work the same way, right? So like the way that you coach other people is an implication of how you coach yourself isn't actually necessarily true. But the way that you coach yourself will definitely tell you a lot about how you coach other people. I'm not quite sure why that's been the case in my personal experience, but also I think with others I've noticed. Across, not just in skiing, by the way, I'm talking about like contextually across the board with teachers and coaches. To that point, what I'm telling you right now and what we're talking about and how you speak, it absolutely can be applied to your students because you can listen to what they say. And that as a coach should tell you, oh, you know what? My student right now is talking in the past tense. Where is their focus? It's on something that already happened, right? And they're dwelling on it. And often when we get into the past, we get sad, generally. It's a very big generalization, but the past often brings nostalgia, which is a form of melancholy and sadness of some kind, right? Or it also brings very much an analyzation type of mindset. So when I think about things that have already happened, they're concrete, they've happened. That means that I can actually analyze them. There's a time and a place for that, right? There's a time and a place for that. It's not necessarily bad all the time. but it does tell you about where your mindset's at if you're thinking about things that have already occurred, not only for yourself, but also for your students. So when you ask your students questions after you do a task and you bring them into a group and you say, hey, like, you know, what's going on? What are people thinking and feeling, right? Listen to what they say. Listen to what tenses they're talking, right? Right? Are they talking about something that's already happened, or can you gear the conversation towards something that they need to do, right? How can you use their self-talk as an indicator for yourself to coach, right? This level of self-awareness is a really good way to look at, you know, the fundamentals of the people skills. If we're talking about, you know, fundamentals as coaches here, right? How do you influence the behaviors and the emotions of your students? Well, it really helps to know what they're focusing on, right? Because their focus is going to tell you what's important to them and where their mind is. And if you can know where that is with a certainty, well, then it makes it a lot easier to coach them towards the outcome that you want, right? And by the way, I say certainty and I need it because your language is an accurate depiction of what you think, right? And if anyone would like to say otherwise, well, you know, the reality is that like what you say is a clear intention of what your thoughts are, right? I'm assuming there's no pathology, right? If there's a pathology of some sorts, it's a little bit different, right? And I love that. I wish we had, I mean, maybe we do have some people who are in the adaptive world, right? And can talk about people maybe who are on the spectrum or something like this, right? And like have a different way of thinking. But assuming it's not the case, maybe, and you could argue that you shouldn't assume that's the case when you're teaching, but right, you can take a lot about what people say and make pretty fair conclusions about it. Is that fair? Do people generally agree with that? I know definitely this, when you're in the ed staff world, eventually, right? You have to do that at a certain point. When you're in an exam and you're understanding how people behave and how they teach and how they coach, you're going to have to say, hey, you know what, like the words you use, they have a lot of impact as a coach. They do. So why wouldn't they have a lot of impact for your students as well? David, what's up?
Yeah, I have a question. What exactly about a student could you infer if they're using a lot of past tense or a lot of future tense or present tense words? Is there any way, like,
well, if
I know you can't, nothing specifically you could do, but in general, is there anything like if someone's talking about what they used to do, should you try to kind of bring them into a present, or is it just something you should be aware about as an instructor?
That's what I would try to do, because because my understanding of optimal performance is that life is lived in the present, right? And like that, you know, if you wanted, like, if I'm trying to get you to do something, you can only live in this current moment right now. So if I have a student who's talking in a lot of past tense and they're talking about things that have already happened, right? It's not that I'm going to like, disregard all that, right? That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to say, like, what does that tell me about their focus? And then is that focus on something that's productive, that's going to help them get to the outcome that I want? Most of the time, it's not, if it's in the past tense. It could be helpful in the sense of it'll tell us what already happened. Yeah. Right? It's obvious. Okay, great. But then what are you going to do with it? Right? Well, like, what's the next step? Like, what's the coaching cue that comes from that? Right? How do you create change in your student? Well, you don't create change by just constantly bringing up what's already happened. Right. This reminds me of, it's a classic one. It's like self-awareness. I'm a big proponent for it. It's really, really important. Okay. But at a certain, it only takes you so far, because, you know, you become self-aware of something that you're doing. Great. Now you're just self-aware of it. You have to create some sort of form of change, right? Which is an active process, which involves active and present things, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it makes sense. It was more a question of how active you should be to bring a student into the present tense. And I guess you're advocating to actually kind of, bring a student.
I would be quite active about that. Now,
as opposed to just being aware of it.
Yeah, sure. Now, I would say that's a personal opinion, right? So I'm not saying objectively, that's like, the truth. Some people might have a different opinion than I do. But how I understand optimal performance, and if I'm just looking at the evidence as well, right? And like what's most productive, well, what I currently need to do is the most important thing, especially not only as a coach, but also as a student, right? When I'm learning from someone else, right? Like, okay, I understand that, I've been told that I'm losing outside ski pressure. Great. I know that. What do I do now? Right? Tell me what I need to do now. Right? You have to think in that way, I suppose. That's what I would argue.
Okay.
Also, yeah, this is open. Brandon said, try to direct this towards an open-end Q&A if you can. This is kind of the Q&A at the end. I'm pretty much done here. My last thing is read. I just want to say that reading is a great way to help with your self-talk and your language, because it's just really repeating words in your mind. You're getting different vocabulary, different sentence structures. Reading is a great thing that you can do. If you don't do it, find a way to do it. It's really, really helpful for your mind. I'm going to be very short about that one. But yeah, any other key questions?
I do have a question. Not sure how relevant it is to everybody else, but when you're talking about the language and talking to yourself, how is it when I'm talking to myself in not my language? Is that any effects? Like, I think I can see that maybe before when my language was not that advanced. I think it might be a little bit different now. But any thought about speaking? And right now I speak and talk and think in English. So any thoughts of not speaking to yourself with the native language, or any effects on emotions, or how do you speak to yourself? Any studies, anything on that?
Yeah, what I would say, Magda, is that, how much more autonomy do you feel now as you did to when you were first learning language?
How much autonomy?
Yeah. To express yourself.
I think at this point, sometimes I feel like I can express myself better in English.
Yeah.
As this is where I live, we are talking about the present, being in the present, right?
Okay.
So
yeah. My point being is that alone shows that you're, and maybe this is not quite answering your question. Forgive me or correct me if I'm not.
It was a very wide open question. Any thoughts will be appreciated.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that this kind of goes to that point that language limits your world. Right. So like if you don't know the language, you don't have the words, you're limited. Right. But as you mastered the English language, right, as you just said it, you probably think better in English now in this moment than you do. Right. So it's like I
think that what you said, it's the language limits me, which I believe I still have words that I do not know in English. Right. So I think like when you said about dancing, I had a hard concept with that. And I think part of that is aligning it with our brain. My brain is very logical brain, and expressing it as dancing, it was just so not fitting for me, right? But I think that's not only just the language, but also how our brain works. So if somebody is more of the big picture thinker and more of a free spirit, they might be using different words and languages and comparisons. And I think I might need to work on the part of, because my brain is so logical, that maybe I need to expand it further and use more descriptive words and open myself up and not be so limited.
Absolutely. And I would argue that you can make that change because of neuroplasticity, right? Like you have the ability to create, to make your brain not only logical, but also more free-formed, so to speak, for lack of a better phrase, right? You can be both. You don't have to be just one. And you can do that with language, understanding your language better, understanding how you can use the word dancing to mean multiple things, right? Just because you don't currently understand it that way doesn't mean that you cannot learn to understand it that way.
And I think we're experiencing different nations in a different way. And I think now, listening to it, different countries are expressing their language in a different way. I've recently heard like the Spanish language, they usually don't really say that I spilled milk, which is like I spilled milk. It's more of the action that milk got spilled, that there's like no consequences of me. It's like, it's not my fault. We tend to say I spilled the milk. So how we are viewing and feeling, or however you call it, like other nations, is probably a lot to do with how they're expressing themselves through the language and how their language is constructed.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So for example, like I'm learning Italian, right? And if I want to tell, let's say I'm at a restaurant and like I'm having an order, and I said like, oh, I would like mushrooms on my pizza, right? In Italian, that it doesn't it translates into something else. It actually is. It's like mushrooms would please me on my pizza. Is like how you would say it. Right. It's again, but my point being is like it's subtly different, right? It's a cool point you bring up about well, I suppose just like different languages and the way that they express certain ideas.
Like I would have a very hard time speaking very softly and quietly in Italian.
Yeah.
Va bene. Like that just goes.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
Yeah, I hear you in that. Trust me.
So like there's some behind, so it's kind of trying to wrap my head around and how to view it, and how the language helps and better understanding and better self-awareness. Which language is more productive toward my goal? Probably English, just because I grew up in the Polish being very constructive.
Yeah, maybe.
So I have more opportunities and my mind is more open in English, right? Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, cool. Thank you for sharing, Magda.